And we got another hour and 7 for you. I'll call it an hour and 6 as we hit 12:54. And Dirty Work has a very, very short show if the weather permits and they can get that game in because they moved it up to a 3:10 first pitch. So pregame's going to start right at 2:10. Man, those guys are going to have to be working too hard. But you know what? We're going to be spoiled on the back end tomorrow when, if all goes well, they got the 10:05er, and then
careful.
We'll talk to you around 1 o'clock. Again, this is all presuming things go to plan.
We
but
don't
you
need
gotta
you
stay
jinxing
ready.
anything, Silver.
Does the broadcaster's jinx apply to just a random talk show segment? Because it always happens at the free throw line or when a kicker's lining up for a field goal or a guy who has struck out too many times in a row, being on a terrible streak. That always happens, but we'll find out if this applies to talk radio and weather.
Yeah, we'll find out because Silver may be doing rain delay theater solo. The way this thing is, if this thing goes a certain way.
We'll make young Kyle stick around an extra, handful of hours after he's adjusting to this morning show bit on the week. So, we'll work it out one way or another. I told you that there was a question going around in regards to the latest we've heard on Steve Kerr, and I want to get your take on it, which I know some of your thoughts, but I think it's a good discussion question overall at 808 KNBR, and that is, don't you think if Steve Kerr was going to leave, he would have just done it by now?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of said that. I think he, to me, he wants to stay. I will, my opinion of what we just read in terms of the reporting in the meeting without a resolution a couple of days ago, 2-hour meeting with Dunleavy and Joe Lacob and discussions about, to me, it's more about the direction and the negotiation about the direction. Again, I think if Steve Kerr, to that point, more specifically, if he was just done with it, I think he would have walked in and walked out. And I think they would have, walked out without being the coach anymore, whether it took 10 minutes or 2 hours. And that didn't happen. So I think that in and of itself, I will say, I believe is an indicator that he wants to come back, first and foremost. To me, it's more just, as I've talked about a ton, now that they have met in the same room and will again, can they get on the same page with what an acceptable goal is going to be for next year's team? Because it relates to the lottery pick, which in the report from ESPN is listed as an important tool within the Warriors' plan to rearrange the roster this upcoming summer. Oh, does that mean you keep it or trade it? Like, that feels like it's part of and not that there's going to be a firm decision made on that in those meetings between Joe Lacob, Mike Dunleavy, and you don't even know where the pick's going to be.
Draft Kuminga's younger brother.
And so it to me, it's questions about direction. Mm-hmm. Are the important part of this, and maybe a negotiation about the direction. Hey, I'm willing to accept some coaching staff changes if you guys are willing to trade the freaking pick. If it's, if it's not in the top 3, and then maybe, and I'm obviously being a little silly here, but then Joe Lacob says, well, if it is in the top 3, you better play the dude, right? That we get out. So it feels like it's those. It feels like Steve didn't walk into it with his mind closed, which I think is an optimistic sign. Now, can they get on the same page? And that's where I think, the basketball decision component of it is important. But again, it's still the negotiation of what do you do with the lottery pick? Is this team, do they have a pathway to being a firm playoff contender in the next year or two around Steph and Draymond Green? Or is it so far gone that it just doesn't make sense for Steve to come back because it doesn't make sense for him to be the, quote, fresh face of a reconstruction?
Yeah, well, I do think there is a fatigue element to this. And I think, he can, if he decides he wants to come back, it means he's got the energy to show up and devote himself to his job. But I do think that a lot of this year, there has been an element of fatigue. He looked fatigued. It didn't look like the joy of the Steve Kerr that we saw for a lot of this stretch. And as I've mentioned a handful of times when we're talking about the future of the Warriors, well, they had it where Steve was in a weird situation where he came in and the expectation was immediately championship because they got it done in year 1, and then they set a record 73 wins in year 2, and then they got Kevin Durant and went to 3 more finals, right? Like, it's been gas on the floor, or pedal to the floor, I should say, since his entire time of being here, and then they've had to readjust the expectations a little bit now with it being a little more out in the open and pronounced. But I agree with you. The longer it goes on, the more and more it leaves the door open to do it again. I think the real question for the Warriors offseason, especially if Steve comes back, and even if it doesn't, is how can you make a team and construct a roster that is suited for 82 games?
Yeah, and that's something that I think even therein lies a discussion, because it goes back to the question I asked Ron and really ask everybody. It's the belief on maybe the management side, or, on the ownership and management side, that there are ways to improve this team in the regular season that maybe don't align with Steve Kerr's core beliefs. And that part, I do think, is somewhat fair. And I'm not talking about, it doesn't have to, because I'm actually of the belief, like, Kuminga was not worth changing it all for. Jimmy Butler and Kevin Durant obviously are worth making some changes, but I think there are a bunch of players that aren't as good as Durant or Jimmy Butler, but are way better than Kuminga.
A lot in between.
That you could look to be more amenable if you're Steve Kerr too, including into the discussion here.
Yeah, no, and I think that's why when we talked about the Porzingis part of it, you made the point that you think they're going to look to bring him back regardless of Steve Kerr coming back or not. But I think that's one where maybe that's kind of the discussion too, where it's like, yeah, he's a player that would work with Steve Kerr. We saw the flashes of what it was like when it looked good. Yet that's another player where chalk off at least 20 games he's going to miss, in addition to the guys you're already devoted to of your big three. Al Horford's another one of those question marks, but he wouldn't be playing back-to-backs. Like, you could only do that with so many guys on a roster. Steph Curry is a no-brainer. That's 100% guarantee. Draymond, if Steve Kerr comes back, you can assume is going to be a part of that, as well as Jimmy Butler. If Steve's gone, now the question for Draymond and Jimmy, it becomes a little bit murkier, and then it's just Steph and maybe more of a younger foundation, maybe more of those guys that you're referring to in between the spectrum of Kuminga and KD that can help him. But, if it comes back, you can do it a certain way. But with somebody like Porzingis in particular, how many guys can you have where you can just assume automatically missing 20 to 25 games?
Yeah, and that's the part they have to look to figure out. And I think that's where Steve, in turn, can say to management, hey, I'm more willing to do X and Y if you're more willing to be aggressive in, say, not holding on to every future asset, or not protecting the post-Steph because by protecting the post-Steph era, you're protecting the post-me era. Like, you're putting less of a value, to get into Steve's head a little bit, you're putting less of a value on the time at which you want me to be here and be committed, based on the fact that you're way too worried about 28 and 29. Well, we can all agree I ain't going to be here in 28 and 29, but I want to be here in 26 and 27 and maybe part of 28. But the alignment needs to be the big part of it.
And do you think the play-in game, the Wednesday, the thriller, was enough to show you, and I'm saying you as in if you're the front office, is that enough to show you, you know what, it's Steph Curry. I don't care if it's one more year. I don't care if it's two. We got to find a way to go all in to have him play meaningful games and series.
I think that is what needs to happen, yes. Whatever that looks like. I think there could be different, like, that doesn't mean you're going to be a title contender. Again, I think people misconstrue that with it's just be committed to, not be viewing the rebuild and the aftermath, too far in the present. Like, that can be your 28 plan, but it can't be your 26 plan. And you can't have the 28 plan clouding the 26 plan.
And as far as the Warriors go with their roster, even take fully healthy, I mean, we did this exercise at some point in the middle of the season, especially when Steph and Jimmy went out. You got to have better fourth and fifth best players, not just in terms of better skill and talent, but also better availability. When we did that exercise of, hey, who was the Warriors' best player last season? It was Steph Curry. Who was their second best player? It was Jimmy Butler. Who was their third best player? I mean, and Draymond's game suffered too. Then it was like, okay, we're talking maybe Melton for a good stretch there. That's an older guy that's had an injury history. Al Horford, at times when it looked right, was one of your best players. Kristaps Porzingis
Who is their third best player this year? If you count Steph and Jimmy as injured, who is their third best? But you can make a case it was Podziemski.
I was going to say Moody had moments too, and then he's hurt too.
Think about that. think about the guy driving off the side of the road thinking that. Like, it might have been Podziemski.
Might have been Podziemski playing the full 82, and just if we're talking
and you know what?
consistent production.
That ain't good enough either. It's kind of like if Casey Schmidt's going to be your best player, you're in trouble because you need your other guys to be able to come through.
Yeah, or in the case of, as we talk about with the Niners, as great as they overachieved this year too, I mean, say you take away, we talked about the importance of the top 6 or 7 players. It was amazing that they lost a couple of those guys and kept going. Guess what happens typically? What you see with the Warriors, what you see with the Giants sometimes when your guys are either hurt or not producing at the top, usually you're not going to hold up a roster unless you've got someone young and special and capable of being maybe a future carrier there waiting in the wings.
There just has to be an acknowledgement that even if they can't be a title contender, that they're still going to be aligned in what the goal is and how they look to accomplish the goal in terms of the roster building. And that can mean, a number of different things. It could mean you keep the draft pick if it's in a certain spot. It could mean you trade the draft pick if it's in a certain spot. It could mean you keep player X. I mean, it's just they have to be more aggressive in scouring the market for different avenues to improve the team. It can't just be, it can start with, I want to get Giannis. Okay, I want to get LeBron. I want to get Kawhi. Like, you can start there, but it can't end there with, all right, well, we'll just make the 11th pick and wait for Jimmy and wait for Moody. And no, because you're going to be 8 games under 500 in the middle of the season. And so that's the part where I think Steve can be amenable to some offensive philosophical changes. I think Steve can be amenable to even some staff tweaks. But the front office and ownership has to be amenable to investing a little bit more into the present than constantly worrying about the future.
I also think if you're Steve, you can't take 2 months to figure out the identity and the rotations and your ideal closing lineup.
Fair.
I understand injuries are a part of this. I understand that the politics of Kuminga added to some of this as well. But the amount of lineups we have seen over the last 2-3 seasons is just not something you can expect from a competitive team.
Let me add another one to that. You can't draft the next Kuminga and have it happen all over again. Like, you can't draft that guy. You can't. You have to figure out, and I think, because I do think that's part of it. And I mean, you look at Ament, right, from Tennessee. That's the guy that I think is kind of projected as the guy that is the most similar to Kuminga that may be around, Nate Ament. That hey, he might be really good in 5 years, but he ain't going to help you next year. Well, you can't take that guy.
No.
You could take a guy that you think can be great in 4 years that is also going to be really damn good next year.
Sure.
Probably can't get that guy unless you're picking in the top 3.
Sure.
So maybe that decision's going to be made for you. But that I do think is, again, the big grand takeaway from what was reported about the meetings to me is it's a negotiation, but it's not a negotiation about money. It's a negotiation about direction. It's a negotiation about, you want this change. Well, I want you to be more invested here. Can they compromise and come up with a collective goal? I feel like that's where it's at. And if Steve doesn't feel like there's enough committed to the now in all of that, even if it stops short of championship contention, then I think he's probably going to be like, you know what? Probably best if you find a different head coach for the remainder of this situation. As much as I really don't think Steve wants to do that at the end of this Steph Curry, Draymond Green tenure, because he wants to be loyal to them.
Well, the other part of that short article and what was reported that gives me an idea that it may be trending more likely that he's coming back, or that he's considering the option more strongly, is when it was all happening at the beginning after they lost that Phoenix game, we were getting the things like the Joe Lacob email came back into play, the speaking out on politics, like all these other things that didn't have to do with basketball that were coming out that I was thinking, man, are these sides just over each other? And maybe now, maybe the pessimist would say there's a little bit of saving face that's going on with the fact, like, this is a basketball negotiation. But the more it's about that, the more I think that this is just a decision where Steve has to decide if he wants to do it and maybe give in to certain areas where Dunleavy, or more specifically Lacob, want him to meet halfway a little bit.
But both sides are going to have to meet. And that's the part that I'm getting at. It's not one side or the other. I think there has to be a balance. Like, nobody is in a position where they can claim that they are completely in the right in terms of what we perceive their views on what should be done moving forward to be. But
it's ultimately going to be Steve Kerr's decision. If he wants to come back, Joe Lacob, I believe, is going to welcome him back.
Yes. That I do think is pretty apparent. And maybe it was less. Maybe it was less apparent a few days ago or a week ago, or it seemed like there was a little bit. I'll just keep it a buck. I think Joe Lacob was starting to look at the other options a little bit, and I think he was starting to look at how it was going to be portrayed if Steve Kerr did decide to leave, and think that it was going to be a pretty negative reflection on him against somebody that's pretty widely respected as a human being, including in the industry. And I think Joe Lacob said, you know what, is it really going to be worth for this like 1 or 2 year bridge to force a guy out as opposed to just kind of let it all die out naturally and together?
Right. If Steve chooses to leave, then he leaves. If he wants to be done, then he's done. That's his decision, and you adjust from there. But if he leaves on the accord, and certainly as it could be perceived, of getting run out of town, well, then what's that leaving you with in the short term for the next 1 to 2 years?
Because I think there has been a major shift in the last week in terms of the way things have been reported from, Warriors are kind of good with it. It's up to Steve. He wants out. They're good, to more like, no, everybody wants him back. Everybody wants him back. Everybody wants him back. Like a shift toward, this is 100% on him. We wanted him back. We're open-minded. We're willing. We're going to pay. So I think that part is going to be interesting. How does that manifest itself in terms of, 1 year deal versus 2 year deal versus all these other things? How do they handle the lottery pick, the roster building, the philosophical changes, the offensive tweaks, and all that?
We'll keep this moving at 808 KNBR. 415-808-5627 is the Golden State Lumber and Showroom text line. Good text from 209 that I want to get to when we come on back. It's Papa and Silver with JD on the Sports Leader.